I'm Courtney.
And I'm Jess.
And we're with the radio station. And tonight we're going to start reading Flora and Ulysses by Kate DiCamillo.
We are going to read chapters 1 through 8, and we are so excited. Let's get started.
Yes!
So the book starts off with a neat little comic strip, and it looks like we start in the Tickman kitchen late one summer afternoon, and it looks like Mr. Tickman has given Mrs. Tickman a very fancy vacuum for her birthday. It's a vacuum that's indoor-outdoor. It goes everywhere and does everything until finally Mr. Tickman said, "It's multi-terrain vacuum. You should take it outside," and whew, there goes Mrs. Tickman, and that's how the book starts. Chapter 1, A Natural-Born Cynic. Flora Bell Buckman was in her room at her desk. She was very busy. She was doing two things at once. She was ignoring her mother and also reading a comic book entitled The Illuminated Adventures of the Amazing Incandesto. "Flora," her mother shouted, "what are you doing up there?" "I'm reading," Flora shouted back. "Remember the contract," her mother shouted. "Do not forget the contract." At the beginning of summer, in a moment of weakness, Flora made the mistake of signing a contract that said she would work to turn her face away from the idiotic hijinks of comics and towards the bright light of true literature. Those were the exact words of the contract, and they were her mother's words. Flora's mother was a writer. She was divorced, and she wrote romance novels. Talk about idiotic hijinks. Flora hated romance novels. In fact, she hated romance. "I hate romance," said Flora out loud to herself. She liked the way the words sounded. She imagined them floating above her in a comic strip bubble. It was a comforting thing to have words hanging over her head, especially negative words about romance. Flora's mother had often accused Flora of being a natural-born cynic. Flora suspected that was true. She was a natural-born cynic who lived in defiance of contracts. "Yep," thought Flora, "that's me." She bent her head and went back to reading about the amazing Incandesto. She was interrupted a few minutes later by a very loud noise. It sounded as if a jet plane had landed in the Tickman's backyard. "What the heck?" said Flora. She got up from her desk and looked out the window and saw Mrs. Tickman running around the backyard with a shiny, oversized vacuum cleaner. It looked like she was vacuuming the yard. "That can't be," thought Flora. Who vacuums their yard? Actually, it didn't look like Mrs. Tickman knew what she was doing. It was more like the vacuum cleaner was in charge, and the vacuum cleaner seemed to be out of its mind, or its engine, or something. "A few bolts shy of a load," said Flora out loud. And then she saw Mrs. Tickman and the vacuum cleaner were headed directly for a squirrel. "Hey now," said Flora. She banged on the window. "Watch out," she shouted. "You're going to vacuum up that squirrel." She said the words, and then she had a strange moment of seeing them hanging there over her head. "You're going to vacuum up the squirrel." There was just no predicting what kind of sentences you might say, thought Flora. For instance, who would ever think you would shout, "You're going to vacuum up a squirrel"? It didn't make any difference, though, what words she said. Flora was too far away. The vacuum cleaner was too loud, and also, clearly, it was bent on destruction. "This malfeasance must be stopped," said Flora in a deep, super-heroic voice. "This malfeasement must be stopped," was what the unassuming janitor Alfred T. Slipper always said before he was transformed into the amazing Incandesto and became a towering, crime-fighting pillar of light. Unfortunately, Alfred T. Slipper wasn't present. Where was Incandesto when you needed him? Not that Flora really believed in superheroes, but still. She stood at the window and watched as the squirrel was vacuumed up. Poof! Thwomp! "Holy bagumba," said Flora.
Chapter 2, The Mind of a Squirrel. Not much goes on in the mind of a squirrel. Huge portions of what is loosely termed the squirrel brain are given over to one thought, food. The average squirrel cogitation goes something like this: "I wonder what there is to eat." This thought is then repeated with small variations. For example, "Where's the food? Man, I sure am hungry. Is that a piece of food? And are there more pieces of food?" Some 6,000 or 7,000 times a day. All of this is to say that when the squirrel in the Tickham's backyard got swallowed up by the Ulysses 2000X, there weren't a lot of terribly profound thoughts going through his head. As the vacuum cleaner roared toward him, he did not, for instance, think, "Here at last is my fate come to meet me." He did not think, "Oh, please, give me one more chance and I will be good." What he thought was, "Man, I sure am hungry." And then there was a terrible roar and he was sucked right off his feet. At that point, there were no thoughts in his squirrel head, not even thoughts of food. Chapter 3. The Death of a Squirrel. Seemingly swallowing a squirrel was a bit much, even for the powerful, indomitable indoor-outdoor Ulysses 2000X. Mrs. Tickham's birthday machine let out an uncertain roar and stuttered to a stop. Mrs. Tickham bent over and looked down at the vacuum cleaner. There was a tail sticking out of it. For heaven's sake, said Mrs. Tickham, what next? She dropped to her knees and gave the tail a tentative tug. She stood. She looked around the yard. Help, she said. I think I've killed a squirrel.
Chapter 4. A surprisingly helpful cynic. Flora ran from her room. She ran down the stairs. As she ran, she thought, for a cynic, I'm a surprisingly helpful person. She went out the back door. Her mother called to her. She said, "Where are you going, Florabelle?" Flora didn't answer her. She never answered her mother when she called her Florabelle. Sometimes she didn't answer her mother when she called her Flora either. Flora ran through the tall grass and cleared the fence between her yard and the Tickmans in a single bound. "Move out of the way," said Flora. She gave Mrs. Tickman a shove and grabbed a hold of the vacuum cleaner. It was heavy. She picked it up and she shook it. Nothing happened. She shook it harder. The squirrel dropped out of the vacuum cleaner and landed with a plop on the grass. He didn't look that great. He was missing a lot of fur, vacuumed off, Flora assumed. His eyelids fluttered, his chest rose and fell and rose again, and then it stopped moving altogether. Flora knelt. She put her fingers on the squirrel's chest. At the back of each issue of the Illuminated Adventures of the Amazing Incandesto, there was a series of bonus comics. One of Flora's very favorite bonus comics was entitled Terrible Things Can Happen to You. As a cynic, Flora found it wise to be prepared. Who knew what horrible, unpredictable thing would happen next? Terrible Things That Happen to You detailed what action to take if you inadvertently consumed plastic fruit. This happens more often than you would suppose. Some plastic fruit was extremely realistic looking. How to perform the Heimlich maneuver on your elderly Aunt Edith if she chokes on a stringy piece of steak at an all-you-can-eat buffet. What to do if you are wearing a striped shirt and a swarm of locusts descend. And, of course, how to administer everybody's favorite life-saving technique, CPR. Terrible Things That Happened to You did not, however, detail exactly how someone was supposed to give CPR to a squirrel. "I'll figure it out," said Flora. "What will you figure out?" said Mrs. Tickman. Flora didn't answer her. Instead, she bent down, put her mouth on the squirrel's mouth. It tasted funny. If she were forced to describe it, she would say that it tasted exactly like squirrel. Fuzzy, damp, and slightly nutty. "Have you lost your mind?" Mrs. Tickman said. Flora ignored her. She breathed into the squirrel's mouth as she pushed down on his small chest, and she started to count.
Chapter 5. The Squirrel Obliges. Something strange had happened to the squirrel's brain. Things had gone blank, black. And then into this black blankness there came a light so beautiful, so bright, that the squirrel had to turn away. A voice spoke to him. "What's that?" said the squirrel. The light shone brighter. The voice spoke again. "Okay," said the squirrel, "you bet." He wasn't sure what exactly he was agreeing to, but it didn't matter. He was just so happy. He was floating in a great lake of light, and the voice was singing to him. Oh, it was wonderful. It was the best thing ever. And then there was a loud noise. Then the squirrel heard another voice. This voice was counting, and the light receded. "Breathe," the new voice shouted. The squirrel obliged. He took a deep, shuddering breath, and then another, and another. The squirrel returned. Chapter 6. In the Event of a Seizure. "Well, he's breathing," said Mrs. Tickham. "Yes," said Flora, "he is." She felt a swell of pride. The squirrel rolled over onto his stomach. Then he raised his head. His eyes were glazed. "Oh, for heaven's sake," said Mrs. Tickham, "look at him." She chuckled quietly. She shook her head, and then she laughed out loud. And she kept laughing. She laughed and laughed and laughed. She laughed so hard that she started to shake. Was she having some kind of fit? Flora tried to remember what terrible things can happen to you advised in the event of a seizure. It had something to do with moving the tongue out of the way or stabilizing it with a stick or something. Flora had saved the squirrel's life. She didn't see any reason why she couldn't save Mrs. Tickham's tongue. As the sun sank a little lower in the sky, Mrs. Tickham continued to laugh hysterically, and Flora Belle Buckman started looking around the Tickhams' backyard for a stick.
Chapter 7. The Soul of a Squirrel. The squirrel was a little unsteady on his feet. His brain felt larger, roomier. It was as if several doors in the dark room of his self, doors he hadn't known existed, had suddenly flung wide. Everything was shot through with meaning, purpose, light. However, the squirrel was still a squirrel and he was hungry. Very. There's a sweet little comic now at the bottom of the page. Looks like the squirrel can smell the crackers in the vacuum. So he's trying to get out all the crackers. Look at all the crackers that are falling on him. Oh, the squirrel looks happy.
Chapter 8. Helpful Information. Flora and Mrs. Tickum noticed at the same time. The squirrel, said Flora. The vacuum cleaner, said Mrs. Tickum. Together, they stared at the Ulysses 2000X and at the squirrel, who was holding it over his head with one paw. That can't be, said Mrs. Tickum. The squirrel shook the vacuum cleaner. That can't be, said Mrs. Tickum. You already said that, said Flora. I'm repeating myself. You're repeating yourself. Maybe I have a brain tumor. It was certainly possible that Mrs. Tickum had a brain tumor. Flora knew from reading Terrible Things Can Happen to You that a surprising number of people were walking around with tumors in their brains and didn't even know it. That was the thing about tragedy. It was just sitting there, keeping you company, waiting, and you had absolutely no idea. This was the kind of helpful information you could get from the comics if you paid attention. The other kind of information you absorbed from the regular reading of comics, most particularly from the regular reading of The Illuminated Adventures of the Amazing Incandesto, was that impossible things happened all the time. For instance, heroes, superheroes, were born of ridiculous and unlikely circumstances. Spider bites, chemical spills, planetary dislocation, and in the case of Alfred T. Slipper, from accidental submersion in an industrial-sized vat of cleaning solution called Incandesto, the cleaning professional's hard-working friend. I don't think you have a brain tumor, said Flora. There might be another explanation. Uh-huh, said Mrs. Tickum. What's the other explanation? Have you ever heard of Incandesto? What? Said Mrs. Tickum. Who? Said Flora. Incandesto is a who. He's a superhero. Right, said Mrs. Tickum. And your point is? Flora raised her right hand, and she pointed with a single finger at the squirrel. Surely you're not implying, said Mrs. Tickum. The squirrel lowered the vacuum cleaner to the ground, and he held himself very still. He considered both of them. His whiskers twitched and trembled. There were cracker crumbs on his head. He was a squirrel. But could he be a superhero too? Alfred T. Slipper was a janitor. Most of the time, people looked right past him. Sometimes, often in fact, they treated him with disdain. They had no idea of the astonishing acts of heroism, the blinding light contained within his outward humdrum disguise. Only Alfred's parakeet Dolores knew who he was and what he could do. The world will misunderstand him, said Flora. Uh-huh. You bet it will, said Mrs. Tickum. Tootie, shouted Mr. Tickum from the back door. Tootie, I'm hungry. Tootie? What a ridiculous name. Flora couldn't resist the urge to say it out loud. Tootie, she said. Tootie Tickum. Listen, Tootie, you go inside, feed your husband. Say nothing to him or anyone else about any of this. Right, said Tootie. Say nothing. Feed my husband. Okay, right. She began walking slowly toward the house. Mr. Tickum called out, Are you done vacuuming? What about the Ulysses? Are you just going to leave it sitting there? Ulysses, whispered Flora. She felt a shiver run from the back of her head to the base of her spine. She might be a natural-born cynic, but she knew the right word when she heard it. Ulysses, she said again. She bent down and held out her hand to the squirrel. Come here, Ulysses, she said. Wow, what an exciting start.
Yeah, I can't wait to hear about the adventures that Flora and Ulysses are going to have, man.
Don't forget to read this weekend. We need to be up to chapter 15 by Monday.
Yeah, we do. And don't forget, make sure you call in the radio station when you get up on Monday because we're going to want to talk about the book. Mm-hmm. And when you call in, you have a chance to win a pizza party for your whole class.
Wow, this is going to be so fun.
I know. Thanks for reading with us.